4 people who watch this on YouTube instead of wherever you get your podcast, which is everywhere. This is available everywhere you get your podcast, by the way. Just, you know that you're listening. If you're one of the 4 people, however, who watch this on YouTube, you'll notice that the camera looks a little bit different because I actually like have upgraded. I got like a really good deal on this camera, and what I've noticed when I like edited videos in the past is that my camera kind of goes all over the place because I was literally just recording on my iPhone, and I got really annoyed with that. So I fixed it, and now it won't like go all over the place, and it has like one static frame, and the quality's a little bit better. The it's different. It's different quality. So like if you're one of the people who watch, like I said, like it looks a little different today, and I'm happy with that because it means we're moving in the right direction. I feel like a professional, basically. I got the mic, I got the camera. Like I'm only a step away from being a professional at this point, which is, garnering an audience. Anyway, as we get into today's episode, you can see that the title is something that I've talked about in the past. I did an episode a while back about circle time and restorative practices, and this one's like a little bit more broad than that. So if you listen to that one and you've been following along for a while, first of all, thank you so much. I appreciate you. You're my hero. Second is if you've watched that, you'll definitely see some things that are, redundant, I guess, in this one, because I'm definitely going to talk about some of the same stuff. But this episode, more specifically, is a lot more about a reaction to a podcast that I listen to. So there's the Cult of Pedagogy and pedagogy. I don't, it doesn't matter. The cult of something. Of teaching practices. So Jennifer Gonzalez hosts this podcast, and I don't always listen to it. It's not one of the ones I listen to every week because she does a lot more like teaching strategy stuff. She interviews a lot of professionals in the field, which is super cool. And some of them just like don't apply to me, so I don't always listen. But there was one about like the discipline problem in schools. I think the title of the episode is, let me find it. I put it in my notes. The title of the episode is Where Discipline Reform Has Gone Wrong in Some Schools, and it's episode 252. So I obviously tuned into that one because I think what I've been hearing a lot as a teacher, basically since COVID, is wow, these kids are out of control this year, or oh my God, not this class of students. This is the worst one yet. And we hear that a lot. And I think what I've heard is it's definitely been like a post-COVID problem. And I'm sick of using that as an excuse. Like I've talked about that before. It's been 5 years. Like COVID has impacted them, but we can't blame it all on COVID. Like we have to adjust things. Anyway, that's a soapbox for later, right? So as we're getting into today, the whole idea is we're talking about this idea of discipline reform. If you want to like follow along with kind of like a transcript, basically I'm just going to be talking through my notes. And I put my notes because I listened to this podcast like one for fun, and then once I was listening to it, I was like, holy shit, like this is good. Like I want to talk about this, right? So I did a reaction, and what I did secondly is I went and then I listened to the podcast again, and I took a bunch of notes. So I definitely have listened to this podcast twice. I used some of it in a paper that I wrote recently for grad school, and basically I've listened to this podcast enough times and I've read through the transcript enough times to know what they're talking about. And I just wanted to like give a reaction because I feel like one, if I can boost, the audience of what this podcast is talking about and what this particular blog post is talking about from Jennifer Gonzalez, I think that only goes to serve all of us even better because of the fact that it's like this is stuff that people need to hear. And the biggest thing in here, right, is if you want like a Spark Notes version, a summary version, an AI written version that's literally just my brain, is that this episode really talks about how there's like a lot of misguidance and misinformation about the discipline reform that we're trying to see in schools, right? I think a lot of schools are moving towards more restorative practices and, following a restorative justice mindset, and I'll get into what the difference is a little bit later. But the idea here is this is following like that mentality, right? Like there's this big misguidance in how that works, and this is what this episode tries to do. So I'm going to kind of go through like how I interpreted this and how I've seen it in practice. And like I said, I'm just walking through my notes, and I link them in the transcript on a basically a Google Doc, but it's through Canva, so it's Canva Doc, which is a wild thing to say. And you'll be able to like follow along, and if you want to read them later, I'm kind of funny, so you can read through all my silly goofy notes because I'm really good at it's just my train of thought basically. So anyway, let's just go ahead and like start off with the very top, right? So there's a link to the transcript and a blog post in my notes. So if you want to follow along or listen to that podcast, definitely give it a listen. I don't think you have to give it a listen before you listen to this, but listen to this one first, and then you can say, "Oh my God, I heard about this on a different podcast," and there you go. That's marketing. So please help me out. As I always talk about, I'm trying to like grow the community a little bit, and as it's growing slowly, right? And like it always happens, in waves, but anyway, so the whole point of this, right, is I want to make sure that these ideas like get out to the public, right? Like I know that her audience is super big and mine's still growing, but the idea here is that it's like, hey, these are super important ideas, right? And like one of the first things they talk about in this podcast is we need people in leadership who have experiences in schools. And I think that is so obvious for us teachers and people who have been teaching for a long time is the fact that it's like we know that people need to have experience in education in order to make decisions about education. But you'd think that that was a more common thing and you'd think that people would do that a lot more. And that's just unfortunately not the case. When we talk about restorative justice and restorative practices, there's a huge connection to trauma informed teaching. And there's a little bit more about this as it goes. Like the two people in this podcast that she, interviewed, that Jennifer Gonzalez interviewed, they are experts in the field. They've done a lot of studying. They work as restorative justice coordinators, and they have done the work to understand what it is we're talking about, right? So they definitely know their shit. Like that's just 100% true, right? So as we're going through this, understand that there is a connection to like trauma informed teaching, but trauma informed teaching is more of like a guideline, I guess, to restorative that leads to restorative justice and restorative practices in schools because, well, we'll get into it. We'll get into it. I don't want to spoil it. So the first thing they talk about, right, is this idea of discipline reform. And I think there's not a lot of people who think that restorative justice and restorative practices by themselves are a bad decision. There's not a lot of teachers that are saying like, "Oh no, we shouldn't give kids a chance to learn from their mistakes and like redo the harm and fix their mistakes," right? There's not a lot of people that are saying that. There's people who are saying like, "Oh, I don't understand it. I wish we could do it better. It's not working the way it needs to. It's, you know, something I believe in, but I don't know how to do it." And kids are coming back to, a big thing that they talk about in here is that, like, a kid gets a referral and they go to the principal's office and they come back with lollipops, right? Like, that's a big thing that teachers are complaining about right now. And we'll get into that, but that is not restorative justice, right? So I think when we're talking about like making this change, we're not talking about a lot of teachers really saying, like, oh, I hate restorative justice, I hate restorative practices. That is a very minimum, a very small number of people who are, maybe express that mentality. And I think that number will grow because of the fact that people don't necessarily understand it. So as I go through this, I'm going to kind of explain kind of my background on it as well. So there are a lot of people that want to make this change, but there's actually like they don't have any institutional support, right? So a big question that they're asking in this is how do we as teachers make a difference towards making more restorative practices in our classroom? How do we make a step towards restorative justice in our schools when, the administrators aren't supportive of it, when the society isn't fully supportive of it, when like the legalities of the situation, like the politics of the situation aren't supportive of it, right? Like there's bills going up in many different states that don't even allow us to ask our students, how they are because we can't do social emotional work, right? Like there's also like the don't say gay bill that's pretty big. We talk about that in counseling school all the time, right? Like that there are, legalities that are getting in the way of doing some of this work. And at the end of their podcast, they have some good ideas, and I will give you some good ideas about like how we can, for lack of better words, like fight the system in a way that we can affect change in our classrooms the way that we want to, and still, follow suit with all of these laws, these initiatives that are being put in place above our heads. And that's kind of like the real thing here, right? So right off the bat, this podcast does a really good job of explaining that there's really no clear definition of like restorative justice. Okay, so restorative justice is definitely more of a mindset, it's more of a guideline to how you want to live your life and how culture goes and how society should function. It's not like this one size fits all kind of definition. So I copied down some quotes that are from the podcast that I think does a really good job of explaining like the mentality and the mindset of restorative justice. And here's the first one. Ours is a justice system that harms people to show harming people is wrong. Restorative justice is a justice that seeks not to punish, but to heal. A justice that is not about getting even, but about getting well. a justice that seeks to make right the wrong rather than adding to the original wrong. The second one is restorative justice is a mindset and a set of practices that support your school community in coming together to build and strengthen relationships. Restorative justice also provides a structure for when conflict or concerns arise by helping us produce more authentic accountability through responsibility, relationships, and repair. So you can see right off the bat, right? Our first one is a lot about like justice and fixing our mistakes and fixing what is harmed and restoring a boundary, restoring a relationship. Whereas the second one is talking about like this is a mindset we should have beforehand that focuses on responsibility to each other, our relationships, and our community. So it's both like the mindset and the result, right? The result is saying like let's fix this, and then the prerequisite is basically saying like we need to have something to fix, and I'll get into that as well. Another thing, you can see me that I've used it very differently as I've started talking about this, right? Like restorative justice is not restorative practices. So think about like restorative justice as being like this umbrella term, and restorative practices are like the things that are underneath that umbrella. So while for example, circle time is a restorative practice that leads to restorative justice, but those two terms are not necessarily interchangeable because a practice is a thing you do, and restorative justice is like the mindset that encompasses everything, right? And in this conversation about discipline and school reform and, things not working, they talk a lot about PBIS. And PBIS people confuse a lot for restorative justice when it's literally not the same, not the same thing at all, right? PBIS is a positive behavior interventions and support. So it's talking about like my middle school, for example, they used to give us like big square pieces of paper that were basically like dollars at the school store. So every time we did something well, we would get like a dollar that could go to go spend at the school store, and the school store was open at the beginning of the day, at the end of the day, and we would be able to use our money to go pay for like a cool pencil or like other different school supplies and other really cool, like I think there were like t-shirts for a little bit more. But that's a positive behavior intervention and support, right? It's saying like here's what the goal is, and we're going to reward you for getting to that goal, right? Restorative justice and restorative practices aren't necessarily aren't necessarily connected to those at all, right? I think positive behavior at school and leading to that can give students the mentality to like want to fix things, right? But positive behavior interventions and support, PBIS, is a lot more about rewarding students for their positive behavior as opposed to fixing any issues that they've had with other things, right? And I think a lot of things with PBIS, the thing they talk about in this podcast is they're talking about how like the student voice isn't always included in that, right? The whole purpose of a restorative practice within restorative justice is to authentically engage the community and keep them accountable. If we say, hey, yeah, good job for turning in your homework, here's a dollar to go spend at the school store, like students, one, they don't really care, right? And two, they don't really have a say in how much that dollar is worth. They don't have a say with what action rewards a certain amount of dollars, right? So the fact that they're already disconnected from what the PBIS is doing is a good key that it is not the same as a restorative practice within a restorative justice mindset. So when, a student goes to the principal's office and gets a bag of Doritos for whatever, that is not a restorative practice. That's not even a positive behavior and intervention and support. That's not even a PBIS system, right? So I think those terms are just like tossed around there. Like education does this whole thing of they let me rephrase that whole sentence because that was terrible. Education does this whole thing where they like jump on a trend and they're like, oh my gosh, like we should try this cool new thing, and then they throw the term around because they hear it somewhere like on a podcast, or they hear it somewhere like in a book or grad school, right? And they throw it around, and I think they don't realize that it's like when they disseminate information like that, they have to like truly understand how to disseminate it, because there's this thing called like the curse of knowledge, where I'm probably doing it right now, right? Where I'm getting on here and I'm just yapping about all these things that I've spent a lot of time like working on and, learning about and actively applying in my classroom. And I can just come on here and yap about it for days because I have learned it, right? But the curse of knowledge is then saying like, just because I know it this well, just because I know it this well, we have to make sure that the people we're teaching know it well, right? And we're teachers, right? Like that should come as second nature. But administrators who are implementing these things don't always know that. So there's a lot of terms thrown around, and then like the second we don't necessarily latch onto it immediately, education says like, oh, there's another term. Let's go try that one instead. And they don't really give it the act of fidelity to work through a problem effectively because of the fact that it's just like, yep, we tried it, doesn't work. We tried it for a couple months and it doesn't work, so we're going to try something brand new. There's no way to see any sort of longitudinal data with that, right? And all that to say is these terms are thrown around a lot. Just make sure you understand what each of them is about, right? And then, like I said, so restorative justice is definitely like this philosophy that kind of guides what we should do, right? And when I mentioned it earlier, like there is this connection of trauma informed teaching. So basically, what trauma informed teaching is there's not really necessarily strategies for trauma informed teaching. I think there are, again, this is more of like a mindset, right? Like we basically, when we are, engaging in trauma informed teaching, we are basically saying that, hey, we know that trauma impacts the way that your brain works. We know that going through a trauma, big or little trauma, we are talking about that does impact your brain no matter what. And in trauma informed teaching, we're saying that since we know that, we're going to adjust how we teach because we know that you might get triggered by a certain thing, right? I think as English teachers, so I my background is in English and I've talked about that before, right? Is a lot of trauma informed teaching is literally just being aware that like if you write a if you ask students to write a personal narrative, you are asking them to connect to something that could potentially be a traumatic incident or something that's triggering, right? Like that is a trauma informed teaching. Understand that that impacts their brain. And then if we critique that, that is basically critiquing like their experience, their trauma, and that's a whole thing, right? It could also be as simple as, oh, we're reading a poem about someone's grandma passing away, right? And the fact that we know that there could be students in our classroom that innately triggers because of a trauma, because of a, past experience, right? And trauma informed teaching is literally just saying, asking, how are the things we are doing in the classroom and in schools matching to how trauma has impacted the brain of individuals? So we are showing that we know that trauma impacts the brain. And that's what trauma informed teaching is about. There's not necessarily specific practices. It's just saying, like, hey, maybe I should be a little bit more cautious about this because I know how impactful something like that can be. And it's just like an overall awareness, right? Like we're doing this, we teach lessons universally and hopefully being able to understand the fact that like, oh yeah, like we know about trauma and we know it's going to affect you, so we're going to have a cautionary, step into the classroom as we're doing this. And in that, restorative practices do take that mindset into account because restorative practices and the whole mindset of restorative justice does talk about, hey, like we know that this is going to impact people differently because of their experiences, and that is a mindset of trauma informed teaching. A lot of what's happening now is what this podcast coined as exclusionary discipline, meaning like, hey, we are going to put you into ISS for the day, or we are going to, put you out in the hallway in a desk. And basically, what that's telling a kid is we are reinforcing their behavior like, hey, go sit somewhere else because we can't deal with you right now, right? It keeps them away in order to teach them a lesson. And what we really in restorative practice is we really want to change that, right? We know removing a student doesn't teach them anything because they're just doing it again, right? Or worst case scenario, they come back with Doritos and without any lessons learned, and it disconnects them from the community that restorative justice is aiming for. So when we're talking about exclusionary discipline, we're saying like go sit in ISS, we're saying go sit in the hallway, I can't deal with you. That is unfortunately, that's stuff that happens all the time. Like I have also been a victim. I haven't been a victim of that, but I have been a perpetrator of that action, right? Where it's like, hey, so and so, go sit in the hallway. Like I can't deal with you. I'm gonna come talk to you in a second. Whereas the restorative justice mindset says keep them in the room unless there's obviously a safety risk. There's a big conversation in this podcast, in the Cult of Pedagogy podcast, that is talking about safety first at all times, and I'm going to talk about that as well. So obviously if there's a safety risk, get them out of there, right? That's a totally different scenario, but we're talking about, methods of discipline and mindsets of discipline, right? So in restorative practices, it's a lot more about like, hey, let's keep them there to grow the sense of community because we are a community. And I'm doing a lot of like the background work right now, you can see, and I'm gonna get into like a lot more of like the ideas and the rants a little bit later, which is the interesting stuff. So this episode might be a little bit long, you guys. So buckle in, put me on in the back, put me on in the background because I have a nice voice, I've been told, right? And if you put me on the back while you're like doing doing chores, while you're cleaning, while you're lesson planning, while you're driving to work, it's just like a silly goofy guy in the background, just yapping, that's all. And you know how much that supports me? That supports me so much. Like it's literally just, it's so many things. So anyway, I we're gonna get to more yapping. And there's a line in here about this exclusionary discipline practice. It was in that conversation where one of the people in the podcast said, "We have a group of traumatized children showing up to a school being taught by traumatized adults." And maybe that's a whole different episode, right? And I think I talked about it before in like teachers needing therapy and all that shit because we do, just as much as the kids. Like not only because if you've been teaching for longer than 5 years, you taught during COVID, you existed during COVID. If you're a teacher right now, you existed during COVID. That in itself is one trauma that everyone who's a teacher right now has, right? And we're expected to show up to the classroom every day and just be okay when we don't necessarily know how to deal with our own traumas, right? So the last thing I want to say about like the background of exclusionary discipline and why that practice doesn't work is because like we're not teaching them we're not teaching them anything when we send them home, when we send them into the hallway, when we send them to the principal's office. There's no one there to teach them what they did wrong. There's no one there to restore the harm that they did to the community because of the fact that they're not in the community to fix it. And there's also this big piece too of welcoming them back into the community, right? When we exclude children from a lesson or from an activity or from a process or whatever, we also have to make sure to welcome them back into the community, right? I think I've seen this a lot, like as a student, right? And when I was growing up, where it's like a kid comes back and it's like all of a sudden we're like almost afraid of that kid because the fact that it's like, oh, he did something wrong, and there is no one there to like welcome them back and like change that mindset that we might have towards them, right? Like kids are so, especially kids growing up in, middle school, high school, where this is really a bigger conversation, right? Is the fact that they are so dependent on their peers and how their peers shape their identity that if we don't actively work to welcome them back into the classroom after any sort of disciplinary action, we're not showing them that they're part of the community. We are actually saying like, oh no, like he's back, right? And we don't want that mindset. We want a mindset in restorative justice that says like you are a welcome part of this community. So when a kid is kicked out, when a kid has a disciplinary action, when there's ISS, OSS, anything of that nature, we need to ask the question, who is welcoming the student back to make sure that they are actively reintegrated into the community. And that's why exclusionary discipline just doesn't work. The other thing that we get into talking about and I think this mindset is pretty clear so far, right? Where we're talking about restorative justice is not a sense of discipline. It's a community and it's a relationship building. Restorative justice is a mindset of building a community and building relationships. It is not a disciplinary act, right? It is not a disciplinary mindset. It's not discipline. Restorative justice is not discipline. It is literally like a mindset that allows people to become a part of a community because of relationships they care about. And I have a whole big ass rant about that later. So we'll get into that. So we are, also talking about this connection then between like this trauma informed practice and this exclusion, right? Like if we are truly trauma informed, excluding a kid could be a potential trigger. We could also be re-traumatizing them, right? There's in this podcast I talk about like tons of research and evidence that like exclusionary discipline practice kind of just enhances that school to prison pipeline, right? Like we are talking about this idea of students are being excluded, which re-traumatizes them or traumatizes them, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, I'm the bad kid. And then we talk about the school to prison pipeline, which I mentioned briefly in my episode about systemic racism and all those sorts of things. But it's both of these things together where it's like if you're doing exclusionary discipline, you're not a trauma informed educator. Like that's just how it works, right? And there's this quote that they say in there. This isn't a quote, but it's an idea that they had in there where it's like we are often punishing students for developmentally appropriate struggles, right? This is a lot in, you see in middle school. I think most of my experience is in a middle school directly teaching, and you see a lot of people that will, you know, punish a middle schooler for talking to their friends during this time. And like I just said, like developmentally appropriate, actions for a middle schooler is to want to talk to their peers and to engage with their peers, right? So for constantly punishing a kid for, talking to their friend. And there are obviously guidelines and boundaries to put in place there, right? But it's how do we teach them to do that in the way that allows them to learn and grow while still in that developmental, state. So there's a lot of misapplication of restorative practice, okay? So this is kind of where my personal take kind of comes into this, right? So I haven't really talked about my background in this yet, but in my in my undergraduate degree, there was a big focus. I think I mentioned this in my last episode of like the mindset and the philosophy that my professors kind of trained me with, right? Is this idea of students come first. You are not teaching students, you are teaching people in development, right? And that was like where my whole entire teaching philosophy evolved from, is this idea that it's like we are student focused, we care about them, we care about how they show up in the classroom. Maslow's hierarchy of needs is like the thing I always refer to when people like question my mentality as a teacher, my philosophy as a teacher. It's like, oh, I'm sorry that I gave that student a snack, they were hungry, they literally cannot learn without having food in their stomach and feeling safe, right? And that is what was stressed a lot in my undergraduate program. Within that, my professors also led a lot of, trainings and professional development that were totally optional. And there was a few I remember going to when I was, in my undergrad program, where it's like a lady that was working in restorative justice, right? And she would come to our university and she would give a little talk. And that was a training. I got professional development credit for that, right? I got credits for that towards my teaching license that, you know, have trained me in this practice before. The year 2019, I was on the MTSS team at my school, and we went to a training down in the city for it was 3 days over the course of a semester. Yeah, over the course of maybe a year. Maybe it was a year, not a semester. Regardless, but we all got training in restorative justice, in restorative practices, and my whole entire early teaching career has been defined by learning all these things, right? And then my second year of teaching, I started grad school, and my first grad school program was completely online, just like my one is now. But my first one was still newish at the time, and there was a lot of choice involved, right? So I could take like whatever classes I wanted, as long as it kind of, you know, collated into something. So I took a lot of classes on curriculum design, which I'll also have an episode about. I took a lot of classes on like literacy, and then, I took classes on restorative justice and education, right? Like I read the little book of restorative practices. There's also a little book of the handbook for restorative justice or practices. I have them on my shelf, but there's a whole link of resources I already posted somewhere. So on my Teachers Pay Teachers, the link descriptions in my podcast, in on my link tree on my Instagram, on my TikTok, just a shameless plug. So when I am talking about this, it's not to say that I don't have any training in this, right? Because I have literally devoted like the first, at least half of my teaching career, the first like 5 or 6 years of my teaching career, to learning these things and applying them in my classroom. So I have seen them applied in the classroom through me. I have, critiqued them in my classroom with my own mindset, with teaching coaches, instructional coaches, with administrators. I have gone to trainings, and I know how to do these things, right? So a lot of the things that I've seen are misapplications of it, right? Like my previous school, and even a lot of the schools I work at or see now in practice, right? Is they have this idea of like, oh yeah, we're doing restorative justice. And it's like, oh, like how does that work? And it's like, oh yeah, like the principal sits them down and they have a conversation about, their behavior and how to fix it. And that is the biggest thing that I have seen in my experience in the classroom is restorative justice conversations, and restoring the harm conversations happening with people who do not have a relationship with the student. I talk about this a lot in this podcast, but this idea of a trusted adult is literally like a paramount, is a huge tenet of restorative justice. Is the whole point of restorative justice, as I've mentioned, is having a community and having relationships that students care about. And a trusted adult is a person in the building that student trusts to have these conversations with and to engage with, right? So if a student, for example, in my class who has a relationship with me, I am one of their trusted adults, and they do something wrong that, harms the community, harms me in some way, they suddenly would be taken to the principal's office to have a conversation with the school counselor, the principal, maybe the dean of students, right? And I'm nowhere to be seen in that, right? Maybe they invite parents, maybe they don't. But the biggest misapplication I've seen of it is not including that relationship that matters to the student in there. And what that you know, misses is a safe place for the student to communicate their things that they need to communicate, a totally missed opportunity to establish the relationship that needs to be, you know, fixed in the first place, right? Like if the person who is harmed is not involved in the restorative justice conversation, is not involved in the restorative practice itself, then it's not effective restorative justice because the student is sitting in a conversation with people that are not even involved, that the student doesn't even care about. And that is the biggest thing I've seen, right? Where a teacher would say like, "Oh yeah, like they had a restorative conversation." I was like, "Oh, how did it go?" And they would say to me, they'd be like, "Oh no, I wasn't in it." And I was like, why the fuck were you not in that conversation when you were the one that has a relationship with the kid, needs to repair the relationship with the kid, and is, one of those kids' trusted adults? How are they're going to restore the harm that they did to you without you being in the room with them? They can't make a decision for how they need to restore the harm with you if you are not involved in that situation. And I know what you're thinking here and saying like, "Oh, but like how can they involve me in the conversation when I'm teaching and when I'm doing all these different things and teachers are already overworked?" I understand. Like I totally get it. And my argument to that is saying that the time that you spent in restorative justice conversation in a circle with people trying to restore harm is the most valuable way that you can spend your time. And I have stories that I've shared on here about that being true, and I have more in this that, show that to be true. But I don't think that there is a more important thing that you can do as a teacher with your time that engage in these restorative justice conversations, in these restorative practices, because in the long haul, that is what will allow you to do your job so much better. So I'm already getting on one of my soapboxes. It's still early on, you guys, on top third of my notes. Buckle up. So when we're talking about the misapplication, it truly is just like a misunderstanding of what a restorative justice conversation is. And if the mindset of restorative justice is relationships and community, that needs to be at the forefront of every decision you make in a restorative justice conversation. The biggest book I think that influenced my early teaching career and still that I think about like every day is Lost at School. I don't know who the author is at the top of my head. It's also on a shelf behind me. And what this book does is it really does a really good job of breaking down like a step-by-step process of what a restorative conversation and what a restorative justice mindset looks like with a student. So it walks you through like a narrative of like one particular student and their journey with like a couple of teachers. And it also walks you through like the steps that it took to get there. And it gives you like the data, the research, the backing of it. And we read this as a book study at my school. Like literally it was 2019. 2019 was a very pivotal year, I feel like, for the last school I worked at because of the fact that we were just on the cusp of like making changes here. I worked with a really good school counselor that was with me in wanting to implement this. I was just about to go teach a brand new class about, how to survive middle school that was very social emotional learning, fit focused and based and, creating this mindset in students of it's like, hey, we need to work on ourselves before we can move forward. And being the person who is going to initiate that class and having a counselor behind me and having this book behind me and having all these restorative practices, you know, applied in my classroom already. Like we were really on the cusp of something at that point, and then I hate to say it, but it's like an ocean wave against a solid rock. It's like COVID hit, and all of a sudden we forgot all of these things. And I think a lot of the mentality of my school at the time is still working on clawing our way back to there. And I think they unfortunately went to a completely different mountain in a completely different space in a completely different world than where I thought they were going to go. So I think, like I said, that book, Lost at School, really was something that gives you a good guideline to um, working through some of these conversations. And I think I already said this, right? Where restorative justice is about what's happening in the classroom. And because I say that because, teachers always joke about like being in the trenches, like administrators aren't necessarily in the trenches with us. And I 100% agree with that, right? Like I always thought that if I ever became an administrator, I'd have to still teach a class. One, because I would miss it, but two is because it really gives you like a ground level view of the system at place, right? Like how can you be an administrator when you don't know what's going on your own school? So when we're talking about restorative justice, a lot of it happens on that classroom level, which is also like, a shining example of saying like, oh, what changes can we make? The changes we can make are directly in our classroom, right? So what's happening in the classroom, how are we building community in the classroom, because if we have community in the classroom and kids have a safe space in a classroom, that can slowly transcend elsewhere, right? Like if we had, imagine every student in the school had a safe space in a classroom, maybe not every classroom, right? Like there are relationships and personality differences and all those things that come into play, but if every student had a safe place in the school, which is, unfortunately hard to say across the board in public education because I don't think every student does have a safe place in the school. If we are building those communities in our classroom that encourage safe spaces and encourage conversations and encourage this mindset, that transcends so far into the community of the school. And I would say that being one person who actively worked toward building community and working towards building these things in the classroom, it you can do it alone, but it's hard. So find a buddy, do some of those things, and understand that how we build community and what's happening in the classroom is the base for where this starts. And the first thing I think I talk about it, this is where we're talking about circle time in here. If you're following along with the notes or look at my notes, we're talking about supports that teachers are being given to create an environment, right? Like I think the teacher mindset, and this is kind of where my mentality basically just says do whatever the fuck you want because who cares, right? Because you are doing what's right for kids. And that eventually that burns you out and it hurts and it takes a lot of time to like rebuild yourself from that. And again, if you followed along on this podcast long enough, you know that story of like how I pushed against the grain and basically it blew up in my face. Anyway, the idea here is what supports are you being given to create an environment where all of these restorative practices and restorative justice responses and mindsets work, right? Like in my class, the biggest example of this is circle, right? So if you don't know anything about circle time, one, I have a whole video, so another shameless plug for watching, more of my podcast, right? But the idea of circle time is every day at the beginning of class, what I would do and what restorative justice, mindsets say is in order to build community in the classroom, you get into a class, you literally sit in a circle, equal footing, right? So the idea is you're all sitting on the floor or you're all sitting on a chair in a circle so that everyone can see each other because that is the point of it, right? If you have like one or two students off behind and not in view of everyone, it obviously creates like a dichotomy, which is something that I fell into, victim of a lot when I was a teacher where it's like, oh, like they're having a bad day, whatever. Anyway, the whole idea is equity across the board. We're either all sitting somewhere equal in a circle so we can all see our faces, right? And then from there, you establish like ground rules, right? Like a couple of my rules were you can't talk without the talking piece, and you don't have to share if you don't want to. And from there, it's like respect everyone, limit your reactions to what people are saying, which is a huge one in middle school, right? Like, and I talk about this in the podcast. It's like, imagine you go around and you share your favorite food, and you say your favorite food is potatoes, and, two kids across the room are like, oh, what do you mean? Oh, that's so gross. And what does that do to you as a person, as a student, right? To have somebody literally yuck your yum like that, right? So you have to establish the guidelines of saying like this place is a place of community, it's a place where everyone has a voice if they choose to use it, and everyone is given their respected time to talk. Because we have a talking piece, we would use like one of my little squishies, one of my little octopus stuffed animals, and we would go around the circle, we'd answer a question, and the question was, something that like builds community. It was something silly, goofy, depending on the mood. I would do like, hey, what's everyone's favorite color? I would every day do a check in question. So in my class, it was always like 1 through 4, how are you feeling today? And we would go around and do that quickly. Feel free to explain why you feel that way if you want to, but no pressure and no judgments, right? So if you're a 1, don't automatically go over to someone and be like, oh, like what's going on? Like they'll tell you if they want to. And if you're a 4, don't automatically assume that everything's perfect, right? Because, sometimes people lie and sometimes people hide their true feelings, right? Because of the fact that they don't feel safe to do so. So there's a big conversation about like no assumptions, don't make assumptions. And so we would go do a quick like 1 through 4 check-in, just get like a vibe check for the whole school day, for the whole period, whole class period. And then from there would be a question like, what's your favorite food? What's your spirit animal? What color do you feel like today? Silly questions like that. Sometimes when it gets, when we had a lot of energy, it would be like soup, salad, or sandwich, which was one of my favorite ones that I still do, where, there are 3 classifications of food and, your class falls into this, they follow the guidelines and they follow the rules of like, we choose a food and it has to be a soup, a salad, or a sandwich. So I would say like spaghetti. Is spaghetti a soup, a salad, or a sandwich? And kids would go around and answer that question. That one got a little bit debate heavy, right? So like the talking piece would get really intense sometimes. And then whatever the question was at the end of circle time, what I would do every single day is I would say, "Hey, does anyone have anything else they want to bring up or talk about as a class while you have the voice and the chance to do so, right?" And a lot of times kids would take that opportunity to say like, "Oh, yeah, I have a basketball game today. I'm really excited." Sometimes kids would talk about like, "Yeah, I'm really mad that I like got a detention yesterday for blah 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 blah." And that kind of stuff like builds community, right? Like we would have kids that are like, "Oh, I heard about your volleyball game in circle time and I like wanted to go. Like, can you give me some more information?" Or there was one time a student got a detention that they didn't feel like was deserved, so they like, had a big conversation about it. We brought up dress code a bunch of times and we would talk about dress code in circle time for hours basically, right? So, when we're talking about classroom supports, I think there's a lot of hesitation and obstacles with classroom teachers to say like, I have so many other things going on that I have to meet, that I have to work for, that I have to do, that limit my ability to taking an hour to do circle, right? And can you do that? Are you supported in doing that? Can you take 5 minutes to do circle? Can you take 3 minutes? Can you take 10 minutes to do? And I think it's about understanding your limits there. But like I said, I believe that those 10 minutes, that 60 minutes, that however long you have to do a circle time, many times I push a lesson back because of circle time. Like, be so for real. When I was, partner teaching with someone else down the hall, same grade, they were like, "Oh, did you read chapter or whatever?" And I was like, "Nah, we sat in circle time." And I and it's that kind of thing that would often be frowned upon against me as a teacher, right? Where it's like, sorry that I gave students a space to address something, right? Like I taught English, so at the end of the day, they are practicing English skills. Like I think circle time is the best thing to say like, oh yeah, they are meeting standards because they are communicating their ideas, they are arguing their ideas, they are public speaking, they are, engaging with a thoughtful conversation. All of that is an English standard. All of that is a standard you can make in any class. And I can, if you want me to find the papers for that, I will, because I believe that is true, right? So anyway, I made time for this and I think it's about knowing your limits, right? And I think it's it's hard if you don't have the support. My exact notes in here, there's a question that says, "Can you take an hour to do circle?" And the immediate note under says, I did every fucking day, and it was an uphill battle because of the fact that no one really understood it or practiced it or was intrigued in practicing it, and I think that's their mentality against me in so many different ways, but also against like just the system. Like we're all pushed to do so many different things, but we taking the time to build this community in your classroom went the longest way because if I can look at a class of students, we're in circle time for 45 minutes. If I can look at the clock and say, "Hey guys, I really want to talk about dress code some more, but what this also means for us is, hey, we're going to fall behind on our essay that we have to write or our paragraph or our reading, right?" And being able to have an open conversation with that about like, if you want to continue having this conversation, here is like the consequence of that, right? Here is the thing we have to do then to make up for it. And those conversations I think are hard for some teachers to have, but I think it goes back to that thing of if you're treating your students and having conversations with them like they are people, like they are part of the community, they will move mountains for you. I can't point to God, I don't think I can point to any times where I spent too much time in circle time and then my class continued to misbehave after because I would ask them, I would say, "Hey, we spent a lot of time in circle time today, so we really got to lock in and do this right now." And they would. 99% of them would. And I think that just goes to show you how impactful and important it is to take that time. So, if you don't feel like you have the support to do that, what do you have the support to do? And that's what I would say. And I wasn't always supported in doing that. And even when I was given like a platform to like talk and share about it to the staff, you know, they would often have that mindset of, "Oh, it takes too much time, like I don't want to do that." And then I think a lot of teachers would come up to me and when I taught the same grade or when I taught them a year before or whatever, they would come up to me and they're like, "Hey, how did you work with this kid? I know you have a really good relationship with him and I'm just really struggling, like I don't know what to do." And I was like, I here are my notes. This is what I wrote, you guys. It says, I don't know. I fucking know them. I fucking talk to them. I fucking give them space to express frustrations. and I didn't say it like that, right? Like you're like, oh well, no fucking wonder everyone in your school hated you. I didn't say it like that. I literally, I literally would just say like, I honestly, what I would do for this kid is I would sit him down and I would talk to him and I would, walk through what the consequences are and I would give them these options and all these different things and then they would look at me and they would say, oh, right, because they didn't have that relationship built with them, right? It's I'm gonna get into this later too, but the idea here is saying like if a teacher were to come to me and ask about a student and I would say like, oh, like just do this, and then they would say like, yeah, I'm not really there with that relationship, and I would say, okay, so build it, so start. Like it's not going to be a flip of the switch thing, and I think that's what people are looking for with restorative justice and restorative practices, right? Like they would come to me for advice and they would expect something to like flip right overnight. And I think in restorative justice, it's a lot more about like the long-term growth and the long-term development of these relationships and the community, right? Like that's how my system worked. So that's why, in my class, the behavior issues I did have, like I was able to sit in a circle with kids, right? Like so many times. It was the coolest thing in the whole world. On my speech and debate team, they did this. In my classroom, they did this. Like when there was conflict amongst them, or there was conflict between me and them, or when there was a conflict that I was having with them, I would say, we need to sit in a circle right now and figure this out because I can't move on without having this conversation. And during lunch, I would see kids having circle time conversations at lunch to deal with their conflicts, right? Like eventually they do it without you. And that is the coolest thing ever, right? So how could I have gone to a teacher and said like, "Oh yeah, like my classroom works like this and this is what we do to fix it." And they would then say like, "Oh, well, that doesn't really help." And it's like, "Well, yeah, because your mindset isn't there, right?" So it's not a quick fix. It's truly not a quick fix. And I think that's what this podcast does a good job of elaborating too. I think a lot of people are looking for the quick fix to discipline and the quick fix to all these behavior issues when there isn't one. It is a day one conversation where you are welcoming students in. And there's some strategies I have for this a little bit later on. But the idea here is it's part of the culture. It's not an immediate intervention. And people get confused with restorative justice being this immediate intervention that has this goal that immediately fixes any conversation or any discipline issue or any behavior issue or any academic issue, and it's just not something that does that. Is it's really have to you have to show up day one. So the timing of this episode comes before school starting for the fall. So day one, what can you do to change the culture so that you can be someone who people are coming to for advice about how to change the culture so that you can lead the way in having these conversations, and I'm getting into that. And the biggest piece that they're talking about, right, is in this podcast they talk a lot about, oh, how do I change my school's culture? And it's truly really is about involving everyone, right? And there's a quote that they say in here. It's, and if my administrators aren't there learning what I'm learning or being asked to do what I'm doing, how could they possibly support me? How could they possibly provide what I need, because they don't even know what I'm doing? So invite them into your room. I think so many times I I had invited teachers and principals and administrators into my room and I would say like, "Hey, I'm doing circle time today. Do you want to come watch?" And there was one assistant principal, and they would always come into my room and they would say, "Ah, oh, dang, I missed circle time again. I wanted to come and get it." And they would say that over and over again, and they never came in. Maybe I think over the course of my time at that school where I spent the majority of my time is like two or three teachers came in and started doing it on their own. And it's hard to like be the one that's constantly pushing against the grain, but we've talked about that. And there's a few reflection questions, right? Where I think there are people that often rely on this thing that it's like, oh, we're all so busy. Everyone's hands are tied. Like, we can't do this. Like, there are too many things that we're doing. And it's like, okay, so, and this is like the work of a school counselor, right? And this is why I'm so intrigued in doing more counseling work, because we have these reflection questions, right? It's like, and this kind of goes into a next episode that I want to talk about, right? But if our hands are tied, how are we spending our time? What are we saying are our priorities? How are we using our resources? And there are ways within a school day, within a school system, to dilute time, to take time away from something else and give it to something meaningful, like a restorative practice, like a restorative justice mindset, right? Like There's advisory classes, there's study hall classes, there's the first 10 minutes in the morning, of first period. There's, during announcements, right? Like there are so many times built into the school day that allow for times like this to happen. And I think those three reflection questions, again, how are we spending our time? What are we saying are our priorities? And how are we using our resources? Are such good questions to get people thinking about like, oh yeah, you're right. We can make time for this and we should make time for this. The next like shining light that I that I heard in this podcast. I'm halfway through my notes, you guys. So keep cleaning, keep driving. If you're at work already, awesome. Have a great day. And I'm gonna keep talking because I'm getting really into this. You can tell that I care, I hope, right? I hope that comes through. Anyway, the next like biggest thing in here is talking about the idea that teachers mess up. The exact quote from the podcast, and this is something that I could rant about for much longer than I'm going to. And it says, I owe my kids apologies sometimes. I owe my kids apologies sometimes. There's so many teachers in education that I've worked with, that I've seen, that I've heard about, that are so opposed, opposed to admitting a mistake to a class, to their colleagues, to whatever. And I think there's this mentality of it's like we mess up. And a big part of restorative justice is leading the way with these conversations, right? I have looked at my classes so many times and I said, "Hey guys, you know what? This is on me. Like this lesson kind of sucks. Like let's do something else." Or, "Hey, like I graded this totally incorrectly." Or, "Hey, it's a little loud in here and that was my bad because I started yapping about a different story, right? I got off one of my soapboxes." And I think it's realizing those things are like when you raise your voice at a kid, it's never personal, right? Like, we get stressed and it's like I think going up to a student, and I've done this before. I talked about apology donuts as a prime example of this, right? Where, one day I was in a really bad mood and the next day I showed up and I was like, "Hey dudes, like I'm really sorry about my vibe and my energy the other day and here's a donut to fix it because I don't really know what else to do. And if there's anything else I can do to fix it, please tell me." And that humanizes you, that creates a community, that grows the relationship, that shows that, hey, making a mistake and apologizing is not an issue. And as a trusted adult, as a model, as an adult in the building, not even one that they have to trust or like or appreciate, the fact that you're going and apologizing for something that you messed up on is huge. You know how many adults can do that to other adults? You know how many people do that in the world? You know how many leaders we see or celebrities we see that fucking apologize so poorly that's not genuine? How cool is it to be the person that can go up and say like, yeah, you know what, I messed up. And that changes the relationship, that changes the student, and then that changes the fucking world, bro. That changes the fucking world. Here's a quote that is a part of this same like realm of conversations, right? Like restoration involves everybody who was involved in the original conflict and harm. And so, if you're just like fundamentally the definition thing, right? If you are not involved in looping back in with what happened with your student, that's not restorative justice. You were never restored, period. I already talked about that, but it's nice to have somebody that's a professional say it. Next. So, this is something else, and I talked about this before too. I think I got a little ahead of myself in my notes. So, this might be some repeats, but I don't care. You're along for the ride. Keep cleaning. A lot of people, a lot of the problems that they pointed out in this episode is people are often trying to skip to the end, skip to the accountability practices without first building relationships. Like something I've heard a lot in restorative justice trainings is you can't restore to a relationship that didn't exist in the first place. If you don't have a relationship, if I don't really care that I impact you, then why would I care about making it right with you? And this goes back to when I was talking about like a student in my class or another teacher's class would go to the principal and have a restorative conversation with the principal. Why would the student care to fix it if the principal wasn't the one that's harmed, right? This is the exact thing that I would say in my school. It's like there was no restorative conversation because I wasn't there. The student needed me there to have this conversation and he wasn't. So this is not restorative conversations. And then the people had the audacity, the school had the audacity, the administration had the audacity to be like, huh, so this isn't really working. And I would literally sit in my seat and I was seething the entire time. My heart was angry, my face was flushed. I used to get so upset because of the fact that it's like I would tell them that. I would say that to all the teachers and I would say advocate for this. And they didn't care. So it's all about this relationship, right? And I think a huge thing in this, and I think they talk about this later, right? Like you can't restore what wasn't there. How can you in your classroom restore something that you never had in the first place? That's like trying to fix a bike that you never owned, right? It's like trying to put a tire on your car when your car doesn't even exist. And that is like such a good metaphor for what restorative justice is. It's because it's like if they don't care about what the thing is you're building, then they're not going to care to fix it. So if a kid comes into your room and, cause a bunch of behavior problems and he doesn't care that he did those things, doesn't care about you, he doesn't care about the community, he doesn't care about the system, then he's not going to care to restore it. So he's going to go to the principal's office, he's going to talk to the principal, he's going to get a bag of Doritos, and he's going to be like, yeah, so actually I was rewarded for this and I'm going to keep doing it because I really like Doritos. And that's what it is, right? Like, I think a lot of what this comes down to as well is um I talked about trusted adults, but the idea is building relationships isn't an intervention, right? Like, have you tried building a relationship? Like that's not the mentality that I want to perpetuate here, right? Like it's not me, like when teachers came to me, it's not something that I would say like, "Oh, if you tried building a relationship with them," I would say, what the results of a relationship are. Like when I would talk to teachers, I'd be like, oh yeah, I would do this and this and this because I can't tell a teacher how to build a relationship with a student, right? Like there is no, a lot of teachers will be like, oh yeah, you really like football, talking about football. And it's like, I don't fucking know about football. What am I going to talk to a kid about football for? A lot of teachers would say that. It's like, oh yeah, I know he really likes, fucking golf. And it's like, okay, bro, but guess who doesn't like fucking golf? Me. How am I going to use that to build a relationship with that kid, right? And kids can see inauthenticity and that's like blood in the water and they're a shark, right? Like if you're not authentic with them, it's not going to work. So I could, use my relationship and tell kids it's like, "Oh yeah, we talk about Minecraft all the time." But that's not going to work for a teacher who doesn't fucking know about Minecraft, right? And that kid isn't going to want to talk to a teacher that doesn't know about Minecraft. So building relationships is not an intervention. I would never walk up to a teacher and say like, "Oh, have you tried building a relationship?" Like, hello? Like you can't do that overnight. Like it has to be something that starts on day one, right? And it doesn't have to be their deepest darkest secrets. It doesn't have to be their deepest traumas. It doesn't have to be like that they have five siblings and one of them is really like you don't have to know that shit. You really fucking don't. The idea is that student needs to know that you care about them and that student needs to know that you want them to succeed, and that is where the relationship in this conversation comes out, right? And it's in that where a student is going to want to restore something with you if they actively know that you care about them. It's always the teachers that come up to me and just be like, oh yeah, well, he's kind of mean to me, he hates me. And I was like, well, have you shown him that you care, that you like him, that you want him to succeed? And they're like, what do you mean? And it's like, bro, please. I So if anyone ever says like, have you tried building a relationship, that's not an intervention. It's just not. I'd say it's a mindset. It's something that starts with the culture. It starts with something that happens on day one. And honestly, if someone asks you that when they're trying to fix the discipline issue that you're having, and someone comes to you or you go to someone and you say like, oh, I'm like trying to do this thing with the kid, and they're like, oh, have you tried building a relationship? It's like, bro, what is the system doing to help me support building that relationship? Boom, bars, you're done. What is the system doing to support me building that relationship with my student? Am I given time to do that? Am I allowed to deviate from some of the standards and lessons that I'm teaching, right? So throw it back at them, and that's the way to change the paradigm, because restorative justice is not a program, it is a paradigm. It's an entire shift of like we are rejecting what society says about accountability and we are trying to do something different, right? And that's the problem. And this is like the hugest this is the biggest thing about this conversation, right? It's like, how do we have conversations about shifting an entire paradigm? If someone comes up to you and they say, have you tried building a relationship? You go to them and say like, okay, what have you done to support me in building that relationship? How can I build that relationship when all these other things are happening? How do we shift my responsibilities and my time and all these logistics we have in place so that there is more time to build relationships that are so essential in effective teaching, right? And that was kind of bars. That was kind of bars. I'm actually just going to sit in that for a second. I gotta take a deep breath. So at the end of that, I'm calm again. We're shifting a paradigm. It's not something you implement. It's not a program that, you read a book and all of a sudden you're a restorative practitioner. You're an expert in restorative justice. It is a paradigm shift that we are shifting a whole society, because the second we shift our school, the second we get everyone involved, and that's this next piece, right? Is we're including the community, including parents, because then everyone knows the system is what's going on, right? It's not restorative justice if these people aren't involved, these administrators aren't on board, parents don't know, right? There's a whole thing in the transcript of this podcast that says, like, it's not restorative justice if, and they go on and on and on about what it's not, right? It is a systemic thing that needs to change. It is a systemic paradigm that needs to adjust and change. And I've talked about this before. The education system is so dependent on immediate change, right? And they talk about this in the podcast, and they have these absolute bars that I'm going to read. They say, by the end of the first year, hopefully I have teachers who are now feeling comfortable with the possibility that maybe this could work. And the last part I'll say is, when I do work with people, I let them know you're not changing the way you do things at school. If you try to make this something where it just turns on and turns off as you walk in and out of the door, it's not. It's not going to work very well, because this is really what Alex said. This is about changing the way you think justice is produced and changing the way you think that the community is formed. It's not something that starts when you walk into your classroom. It's not something that ends when you leave your classroom. It is a mindset shift. It is a paradigm shift. It is a societal adjustment that needs to be changed, right? And the next part of this, right, is where there's so much data, and I talked about this in my last episode, so I'm not gonna yap about this too much, but there is data, right, that supports their super disproportionate suspensions of children of color. There are numbers we're looking at that are showing us that there is there is disproportionate um numbers there that are impacting people, right? So if we're talking about how do we change the system, a big conversation started. And I think I've read this exact line before. I put it in a paper I wrote. It's, if you don't unpack the ways that bias is present, racism is present, ableism is present, all of these things, then the way you implement your restorative practice or your PBIS or literally anything else is going to contain your bias, your racism, and your ableism. So if you don't have conversations about what your biases are in the classroom, those biases will show up in the work you're trying to do. And that is totally oppositional to what restorative justice is. Because if you're actively showing bias towards something or someone or their mentality, then you are discluding them from the community. And all of a sudden, your restorative justice mindset falls apart, because that ableism, that bias, that racism is showing up in the way that you do things, and that's not how you build a community. So this is where we get to the point of the conversation where it's like, okay, so what can I do next, right? So what can I do? And I wrote fucking have circle time. There's a whole episode about it if you need it, right? And I think this big piece, and I'm going to talk about, there's a little, I saw a note farther down in my notes, and it's like, close your door and teach. You don't need systemic support to make relational changes in your own classroom, right? Like, you don't need your principal to come in and say, hey, yeah, yeah, start building relationships with your students. Good job. And for those of you that aren't watching the video, I have a thumbs up. You don't need that support to begin doing the work for, teachers and students in your classroom. Like, you really don't need that. Um, you don't need that go ahead. Just start building relationships, right? Like, start doing the work, because that's truly what it comes down to, is you existing in a space that allows you to do that. So you don't need the support to do it. Close your door and teach, right? And I think there's something in here too, that you can have these sort of conferences, right? But I in the classroom about behavior, but I think don't expect it to, like, you can't just wake up one day and have a sort of conversation, right? You have to build that relationship prior. So this is why I'm saying it's such a good time that this episode is coming out, because I think the point of it is saying, like, you have to start from day one building a community, because you can have a more restorative classroom. Teachers can have a more restorative classroom. Starting on day one, you can say, like, hey, this is what I have done for the past few years, and it says, what do you want this classroom to feel like? When you walk in, how do you want to feel? And how can we help each other get there, right? Like, what do I want to feel like as the teacher? What do you want to feel like? How do we all agree to this? How do we make it right when these things don't go wrong, right? Like, this is hard work, but this is a day one conversation, right? Where you walk into the classroom and you ask your students, how do you want to feel when you're in this classroom? Because that is how then, a week from then when there's an issue, right? Because week two, there's already going to be behavior issues, right? So, how do you then, that's how you then have that conversation later where it's like, hey, remember when we said we wanted to feel, excited when we came to class? Like, I don't know, I didn't really feel like that. So, how do we fix it? And starting on day one with a simple relational move like that says, like, hey, I care about how you feel. They'll move mountains for you. They'll move mountains for you, bro. They had a very good quote about this, right? And there's two actually. I'm just going to read them back to back, right? It's the first one is, because if I know what I do that makes my classroom great on purpose, when it's not just an accident, it means when I'm about to flip my lid, I can remember the practices that I have to do. I don't go so dysregulated that I just hope I do the right thing. Because basically what this is saying is, like, as teachers, we get stressed too, right? Like, we have our little moments of, hey, like, I don't know what to do today. But if I don't know what to do because I'm stressed and I'm overexhausted and I'm overstimulated and I can't exist in this classroom right now. But if we know on day one what makes our classroom great, if we know the choices and the moves that we can make as teachers on day one, then we know what to do when we feel like that, right? Like, we know how to make adjustments. And I already said this, I think, but the other one is saying we all agreed to this. This is how we want to feel when we walk in and how we make a functional classroom. And this behavior you're doing right now, that's just not it. And that, I put some of my own personal spin on that. And it's saying, like, homie, like, you wanted to feel this way. I don't feel this way right now, and what you just did proves that. So how do we fix it, right? A big quote they have in here is, how do we pull them back in when they break this agreement, right? Like, how do we bring them back into the classroom when these moments happen? And I think that I talked about that at the beginning, where we're having this conversation about, like, we exclude kids a lot, but then we don't talk about how we bring them in, right? We don't talk about how we bring them back. And if you're going to do restorative conferences, I think posting the questions on, like, what I've done in the past is I've put it on little, like, sticky notes for kids. We used to make, like, plates that have, like, the rules for circle time in there, right? And if you post the restorative conference questions, if you post, like, hey, how do you fix the behavior that you did? Or if you post your classroom agreements, you can point to those, and, like, it literally becomes a part of your classroom. And that is such a good way for students to students know what they're going to be asked in these situations, right? So students know that this is a place where we're gonna care. And there's some last notes, but I feel like I've already talked about these. I feel like I've just been yapping like crazy. Has it already been an hour? Bro, I'm so sorry. Actually, you know what? Keep cleaning, keep driving, just keep me on in the background. I hope this is soothing for you. I hope I didn't interrupt your vibes just now. And so they're talking about, in this point, how do we bring the student back in? And I think there's this whole piece of the trauma informed teaching that they have a quote about in this podcast. They say trauma informed education is about people needing to feel safe. And so if I cannot ensure that everyone's going to be safe, if these two kids or if this group and that group are in the same room together, people cannot commit to really basic safe behavior, then the trauma informed thing to do is to create some space. So like I said, like, utmost importance is safety, right? Like, the point about creating a safe environment is anything that a kid does outside of the classroom needs to come back in with safety in mind, right? And holding them accountable to that change. And that will be how we fix the problem, right? I wrote this down here at the bottom, where it's like, just kicking a kid out, that's like a tourniquet, on, like a wound. Is you're stopping the blood flow for like a second, but you didn't do any of the work on the actual wound, right? You're just holding off the blood flow until later. And that's a really disgusting analogy, but it's so accurate because of the fact that it's saying, like, when we're not teaching these kids, when we're not sending them home with support, when we're not teaching them what to do about their behavior, when we're not working with them to welcome them back into the room, it's not fixing the wound. It's literally just stopping the blood flow for a second. And there's a couple other things in here about, like, hey, if you have an ISS or OSS coordinator or a dean of students or a couple of counselors, like you can transform that role into a restorative justice coordinator, like school counseling role for the whole school. Like I would love to do that personally, but it's this idea of like there's funding for these sorts of things, and it's again how are we spending money? How are we using resources? How are we using what we have at our disposal, right? Like there are opportunities for you in your building to make these changes. There is another bar of a line that they said, and it says, if your students are showing up traumatized and disconnected, it doesn't matter how awesome the program is, it's not getting through. And that's about a curriculum program, right? Like you can, I think schools often, and this is the other thing too, and I this is something I have another rant about, which I won't go into, but schools are more apt to spend money on big literacy curriculums and big literacy doctrines and big, giant curriculums that cost like $2,500, where everyone gets their own math workbook and everyone has access to this online program where that checks their answers right off the bat, and it like does all these things, and teachers don't use the whole book. They're not utilizing all the money they spent, right? Some teachers are totally opposed to it, so they don't do it at all. And schools will spend thousands and thousands of dollars on a curriculum that's what they think is immaculate. It'll be approved through the board. It'll be approved through, a year of conversation. Like, yeah, this is a really good curriculum. Like, it's going to change everything, right? But if your kids are showing up traumatized and disconnected, if they're showing up and they have things that they're bringing in the classroom with them, if they have a disconnection to what's going on with you and each other in the classroom, like they are not going to care. The program is not going to fucking work. And I'm going to read this again. If your kids are showing up traumatized and disconnected, it doesn't matter how awesome that program is, it's not getting through. And, show that to your principal. It would be awful of me to have this conversation without talking about like the political impact, right? And I literally wrote talking about this would make the episode too long. But this is where I talk about close your door and teach, right? So we talk about in this podcast, I also talk about like what is your locus of control right now in the world, right? Our locus of control is kind of limited. As teachers, we feel very limited in, what society is changing into, what politics are changing into, what the legalities of our situation are changing into, and realizing what is our locus of control in this conversation, in this relationship with our jobs and our students and our administrators is what can I control right now that will help make positive changes. And I literally wrote about this quote that I'm about to share is like, I couldn't relate to anything more, right? Because I feel like this is the moment where I was like, I need to do an episode about this because this is exactly how I feel like I was working against the system for so long. And I'm not here to say like, oh, I'm standing on business and every time I enter the room and I'm a perfect educator. Like I'm not, right? Like I'm not. But there's so much power in understanding your locus of control and realizing that if I'm going to administrators and they're not listening, if I'm going to an administrator and showing them numbers and they don't care, and I'm going to administrators and I'm welcoming them into my room for circle time and they don't care, if I am actively trying to make differences in students and without any support, like of course I'm not going to do it the way you want to because I've reached out my hand and you're not grasping it, right? So this quote is literally understanding your locus of control in as a classroom teacher. You might not be able to change your whole school system, but you can absolutely transform what happens in your room. You can be that teacher that everybody looks at and wonders, why do all the kids feel safe in there? How come everybody wants to go there for lunch? How come that teacher's always being asked to run clubs? And some teachers are going to be jealous and some teachers are going to want in. And that's how you get to spread the word. You get to be the seed because people are going to start to notice that your room feels good, that you're happy to come to work, that you don't feel so frustrated anymore. That I think reading it again kind of changed me, right? Because I think the problem is, right, and if you're in a similar situation, I think there's this mentality of saying like I'm going to do what I need to do, right? Close my door and teach. Like I'm going to show up for my students the way that I need to and the way that I feel like they need me to. And I can't change what happens on the system, right? I think my issue is feeling like I was in a space where it was more jealousy and more anger and more disapproval because it wasn't the paradigm of the system that I worked in, where I was pretty loudly, in a lot of ways, going against what would be considered the paradigm and the culture of my school and what they created for kids. And every conversation I would have, it would be like, oh, you're getting written up for this, or oh, we're changing that, like, please don't do this in your room anymore. Like, it would literally be conversations like that. And maybe some of that was deserved, right? But at the end of the day, the conversation was, we've asked you to change and you're not changing. And I said, okay, fuck you then. So the point is, at my old school, is like, everyone did see that, right? Everyone did see that. Why do all the kids feel safe in there? How come everybody wants to go there? How come that teacher's always being asked to run clubs? And it ended at anger and jealousy in my old school and my old school's culture. So that, to me, like, even though I was happy to show up for my kids, and I did show up for my kids for 8 years at a system where I was literally being burnt out because everybody saw this, but the culture of my school was one that just cultivated this sense of distrust and jealousy, right? Like, I I just I can't say more for the fact that your school culture and the people you work with matters so much in how you're able to sustain something like this, right? It's one thing to go against the grain and have people in your corner that are, asking you questions and coming into your room and trying to support you in that, or trying to support themselves in doing that, right? And not just looking at you like, oh, I'll never do that, or wow, I hate this, I hate that he gets that and that I don't, right? It's so important to find the people that will walk with you instead of pushing against you, right? Instead of building up walls to box you into where you're supposed to be, they built ladders to get you over them, right? And I think I could say more about that, but I think understanding it should be about, hey, like, this is what I wish I would have heard, right? I wish I would have heard someone say, like, wow, like, Kassick is doing something really great. I want to know, like, what it is. It was more about, why don't I have that? I should, right? And it was, I have some lines in here that I wrote that I heard all the time, right? Why are students always in your room? They need to be in class. Oh, he worked with you on that? He probably cheated, right? He's supposed to be in my room. Oh, I wish you would have told me that. And I also wrote in here, it's this is a much larger conversation about school culture, right? If you're in a school culture that allows you to do these things and exist in them and be supported in doing them, then that's huge. That's amazing. We love to see it, right? But if you're in a school culture that's literally gonna get jealous and angry and push against you, right? Like, that's the mentality of constantly working against the system, right? Like, I found joy and fulfillment in working with the kids in the way that I did, but the people I work with were limiting that, and it got exhausting. It got exhausting to show up and work with people who don't believe in the same things you did. It got exhausting to show up to value what you're doing in education without somebody else also valuing you in that conversation and saying, like, how do I be like him? How do I incorporate more of that instead of just like making me the enemy, right? Like, so I was exhausted. I got lazy. I got tired. I got written up, and then eventually, like, I stopped caring. I stopped caring about what they would say to me because I knew it was right. And then 8 years in, I literally quit, right, to the detriment of probably a lot of kids, and I'm still grieving a lot of that because it is exhausting to constantly feel like you're doing the right thing, and then at every turn by other professionals in the building saying you're not. And that's my drama, I guess. So, what are some other things that we can do? I'm almost done with my notes, so just finish your cleaning really fast, okay? um, I think circles are great. Circle time is great to do. And then what a switch up. Okay, so sorry. We're I think having circles in your classroom and having the space to do that is, we need to give teachers the time and space to do that, right? Like, you can't just wake up one day and have a circle. You can't just, hey guys, let's get in a circle. You have to make sure it's planned. Like, you have to write it as a lesson plan, right? Like, circles are huge. It is the cornerstone of what I did as a teacher and what I still do as a teacher. Is it's huge in building community. It's huge in building relationships. You can't just jump into a conversation about a student's issues and how they're behaving in class and how to fix that, right? Like you have to work on that. So teachers need guidelines, they need practice, they need lessons and time to plan lessons about what circle time will look like for them. Because the other super important thing is circle time in my room doesn't look like circle time in some other teacher's room. And I think any administrator that says like your circle time has to look very similar is wrong, because the whole point, like I said before, is about authenticity. So if you're being told how to run circle time and what to use as a talking piece and which questions to use and how to go about the circle and your rules in your classroom, like that's also not restorative justice because it's inauthentic. They're breaking the first rule of restorative justice, which is inclusion and accountability for everyone's voice. And if your administrators aren't giving you a voice in what your own circle time looks like in your classroom, then that's not restorative justice either. When we're talking about like making space for like, restorative conversations and restorative conferences in class, right? Like teachers are really creative, and I think the podcast does a really good job of emphasizing this fact, right? Like if you need to have a conversation with a student about a behavior, what can you put on the screen to distract the rest of your class, right? Like, hey guys, work on this problem for the next like 5 minutes. I'm gonna go finish one thing that I need to accomplish real fast, right? And then it's like, hey, so and so, can we like chat for a sec? Can you come over to my desk? And it doesn't have to be like this big exclusionary thing. They are still in the room. If that becomes normal, it's easy, right? If it's every time, it's like, hey guys, work on this problem on your own, try it on your own for a sec. Oh, hey guys, like solve this puzzle real fast, right? Like teachers are so creative. You can make the time and space to have a conversation in the middle of class, right? It's not a shameless plug here, right? Like I have a whole book, copyright copyright starts now. So don't take this idea from me, please. Anyway, I have a whole book about it. I think I'm gonna call this book Hallway Conversations. And it's like that moment when you pull a kid aside and it's like, hey man, like what's up? What are we doing? How can we fix it? And I would have these conversations in my classes, in my clubs, on my teams, at soccer practice, at soccer games, at, on the bus. Like I would say like, hey, like what's happening right here, right? Like I would sit on the floor in the hallway and I would have a conversation level with the student, like our own little mini conference. And this became so normalized in my classroom that teachers would see, right? They'd be like, oh yeah, Kassick just talking to him in the hall, right? Like teachers would know that. Other students would know that. If I pull a kid out into the hallway and we were sitting on the floor, kids would know to be like, oh, and they would walk around. They would walk away, right? Like I cannot say enough how easy it is to implement something like this if it's normalized, right? Like the idea is that students understand, right? Because even students that would come back, like at my old school, like it was, it's a pretty small school. So you'd have like, high schoolers coming down and visiting all the time. But even like as those high schoolers got older, they would see me sitting in the hallway with a kid and they would make eye contact with me. I'd just like shake my head a little bit and they would walk away, right? And because they would understand that that's the mentality and that's the culture that I built within my classroom and with me as a teacher, right? Like when I'm sitting on the floor in the hallway with a student, it became so normalized that they would see it and they would just deal with the problem themselves. They would, wait to ask me to go to the bathroom. And that's what this mindset is about. It's about literally changing the paradigm and changing the culture so that students and everybody involved knows that that is what you are doing. You are fixing the problem. You are having a conference. You are working on some, deep stuff and you're fixing it together, right? And I think that became so normalized that it was part of the culture. And that's why I was all those things that I was to so many different kids, right? And teachers got mad because they couldn't do that. And I'm just gonna, tell you how it is. Um, there's also a time in here, right, where we're talking about like how do you have these conversations in class? And if you don't know anything about it, I'm not gonna get into like a big, huge conversation about it now. Maybe I can do another episode if there's interest. But modern classrooms is teaching like philosophy, mentality, mindset framework that really, really gives a good space for this conversation as well. So very quickly, modern classrooms, you can Google it. They have their own podcast, they have their own website, they have a whole bunch of lessons and like trainings and stuff you can do. But modern classrooms basically is saying like I'm in the room as a teacher, but I should not be lecturing. I should be guiding them with lessons, right? So modern classrooms basically says like you plan out a whole unit prior and you assign it to students as you go, and basically they're allowed to work at their own pace, right? Like a student A can be working on, lesson 12, and then student B can be working on lesson, 8, and then student C can be working on lesson 2, right? Like, and as long as it's all done in time and they have different varying levels, of conversations, and it basically like the classroom runs itself, right? Like when I was doing this as an English teacher, it was very much like students walked in, we did circle time, we did a quick like whole group like grammar lesson, I gave instructions, and then I said, hey, like your job, your goal for today is to get to this lesson. And then they would work on it, right? Like they'd have videos, they'd have the assignments, they'd have everything. I was just there to guide and check as they went, right? Beautiful way the classroom worked, but it also worked beautifully because I could say like, hey, so and so, you're having a rough time right now, come over here so we can have a little restorative conversation. We can have a little circle, right? And does that get in the way of me like guiding them in the instruction? Of course it fucking does. But again, it matters more, so I'm gonna have that conversation first any day of the week, right? So it it provides space for that because modern classrooms is a way for me to involve myself with more one-on-one and small group conversations because teachers shouldn't be in the front of the room all the fucking time. That's insane. And I can't tell you how much that changed like my mentality of teaching and what it looks like. So if you don't know anything about modern classrooms, go look it up. It'll change your life. And there's this huge piece in here about restorative justice. It's about community, right? Like we are in this together. I think there's also a huge plug in here about like the society and where we are, right? Like everyone in society is struggling, and the podcast kind of ends on this note towards the end, right? They're talking about this idea of like we're all struggling, so no wonder our students are struggling too, right? And the backbone of restorative justice in the classroom is literally saying like, hey, if one of us is struggling, we're all struggling. So how do we work together? Because it is a community, because it is a space to learn and grow and become people. We're taking care of each other, and that's not the mentality we see in society today, right? Like if one of us is struggling, we kind of look the other way, or we, at worst, we ridicule them, right? Like what kind of a difference does it make if we show students in our classroom, if we show students in our classroom that we are working together to help each other, to support each other, to learn and grow and become better people? How does that translate when they get out? How does that translate when they go home? How does that translate when they're at the grocery store, right? And I'm not here to say like, the whole world will change and we're changing the world with everything we do in our rooms, but we kind of are. So take that with what you will. A couple of finishing notes is there literally is no shortcut, right? And I wrote 5 lines for this, and it says, take your time, figure it out. It can't happen overnight. Give yourself grace. You can't burn out on all of these new things. And this is the conversation that I would try to have with people when I'm talking about like how my classroom was run and how restorative justice and how restorative practices take place, right? It's you can't just wake up one day and do it. Start tomorrow. Say like, hey guys, let's do a quick attendance question. Usually say here, I'm feeling a little silly goofy today. We're just gonna do an attendance question. And the next day, oh, you know how I did an attendance question yesterday? I kind of like that. Can we all just like sit in a circle instead this time? And boom, there you go, circle time, 2 days, just like that, right? Like there is no shortcut, right? Like figure out what works for you, figure out what's authentic, and give yourself grace. Like we make mistakes, right? There is no way that you can walk into a middle of the school year and fix this and do this, right? So there's another line that I'm gonna write on here, and there are some resources I posted, and I'm gonna have this, like I said, the notes that I'm kind of reading off of have some books and stuff you can look into, and the podcast itself will give you some of those notes. They have descriptions as well that kind of give them here, but it kind of ends on this note. Yeah, it says, begin your own practice with connection, with community, not trying to respond first, but building that restorative base so you have something to restore to. And that's really the mentality that we all need to have as we go into a new year, we go into a new system. It's literally saying like, how do we start with connection and community and not with a response? Because we have to start at the beginning. We can't start at the end. There's a part in the transcript that I literally wrote, "Are we optimistic?" Yes. See the transcript. You have to listen to this part. So it's towards the end of the episode, but they're basically saying that dream of what your classroom is going to be like, because you can make it that way. We have the power. And then it kind of asks you this question, is like, what was your dream classroom? Like you can make that happen. You can go in and you can make that classroom a reality because of the tools and the ideas and the mentalities you have. Like odds are, if you're listening to this podcast or the other Cult of Pedagogy podcast, that you are someone that cares and wants to do well for your students, right? And then they end on this note that I resonate with a lot because it's talking about like I've ranted a lot in this episode about like how it feels like we're up against a wall and how it feels like we're, the only ones making changes and the only ones being different and the only ones working towards like what's good for our students. And I've fallen into that like a lot, right? But then I look around and I notice that there are, people following me along, and I notice that there are hundreds of people, maybe not millions, of people listening to the Cult of Pedagogy podcast where they're talking about like there are so many teachers across education that are willing to make the changes to do better, and they end on this quote that says like, we are the ones we've been waiting for. And that's just talking about the teachers who are willing to make the difference. We can be the ones that we've been waiting for because we are the ones that can make the difference that needs to be made. So with that, what an intense little note to end on. With that, I've kind of exhausted myself. My energy is definitely like hit a valley just now. So I don't know if you can hear it in my voice or see it on my face or whatever, but I could talk about this forever. I am so hopeful that this will start conversations, that I get to talk about this more and I get to continue making things like this, because I believe that these conversations matter more than any other conversation in the world of education, right? Because this is what makes a difference. So, if you're interested, please reach out. I'm leaving all of my notes and links and everything in the description. And, there is, follow me on all the things, download podcast, share it with someone you think you might like it, because that's what helps me grow. That's what helps these ideas get out here. So if there's someone you think you might like hearing this podcast and listening to me rant to it for an hour and a half about, all these different things and making silly jokes and being just a silly, goofy guy, then share it with them, please, because that helps. So if you're listening to this, share this with one person right now. It's like a think, pair, share. It's like, get up and share this with one other partner. Share this with your 3 o'clock partner. Share this with your 4 o'clock partner. Please just share it with somebody if you're listening. Just send it to somebody. Post it on Facebook. Blast me up, hype me up, you guys, because I can't be the only one. I can't be the only one here, right? So, anyway, thank you so much for being here. Thanks so much for listening. I hope to see you in the next one. I'm super proud of you. Thanks so much for sticking around, and I'll see you next time.